If you are part of the men's rights movement, exploring red-pilled concepts, or just fiercely curious about the ideological battles shaping modern masculinity, this deep dive is custom-tailored for you.
It really is. It's a dense one today.
Yeah, but before we jump into the material, I need you to hit that like and subscribe button right now to support the show.
Please do.
That helps us keep bringing you these extensive, uncensored explorations. So today, we are undertaking a comprehensive review of a highly provocative ebook. It's titled No More Simps, A Man's Guide to Power, Purpose, and Prosperity by Conrad Riker.
And the text is really positioned as a no-nonsense manifesto. I mean, it is a literal battle cry for men feeling squeezed by modern society.
Absolutely. And if you want to read the full uncensored text after this analysis, you should check Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the book.
Highly recommend checking the source material yourself.
Right. And to make sure to follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack.
Because the author constructs this work as a lifeline, really. A lifeline for men navigating a system that, in his view, demands their utility while offering little to no societal respect in return.
Yeah, it's a dense read.
It is. It attempts to reverse engineer the cultural shifts of the last few decades.
Okay, so let's unpack this. We are taking a deep dive into an extensive text designed specifically for the manosphere.
Right.
And because this source material contains highly politically charged content regarding feminism, cultural Marxism, and gender politics,
Very charged.
we want to make it absolutely clear to you right now that we are not taking sides.
Exactly. We are impartially reporting on the content provided.
We are not endorsing these viewpoints, but rather acting as your guides to objectively convey and analyze the ideas contained in the original source material.
We are just mapping out the architecture of Riker's worldview here.
Right, so to lay the groundwork, what is the overarching premise of the book?
Well, the core argument is that modern institutions, ranging from the legal system to education and the media, have been systematically captured by feminist and Marxist ideologies.
And he argues this institutional capture has resulted in a deliberate war on men.
Yes. The book operates as a red pill playbook. Its stated mission is to help you understand the history of our institutions before they were captured, to reject modern societal scripts, and to reclaim what Riker frames as biological and historical imperatives.
Which are the roles of protectors, providers, and leaders.
Exactly.
He initiates this whole argument by taking aim at what he terms the myth of gender equality.
Right. Riker's position is that modern gender equality policies are fundamentally flawed because they attempt to overwrite biological realities.
He leans really heavily on evolutionary biology here,
He does.
arguing that men and women are naturally different and, by extension, not interchangeable cogs in a societal machine.
The text asserts that for hundreds of thousands of years, humans survived due to a rigid, necessary division of labor. He points to physiological differences.
Like the muscle mass statistic.
Yeah, noting that men possess, on average, 75% more muscle mass.
Which is huge.
It is, and he says men are evolutionarily wired for risk, competition, and aggression. Those traits were strictly required for hunting and protecting the tribe.
While women, conversely, are described as having a higher pain tolerance and being hardwired for nurturing and caregiving.
Right. So Riker's foundational argument is that modern society's attempt to just ignore these deeply ingrained evolutionary traits is an exercise in futility.
And he brings up the Scandinavian paradox to illustrate this, which I found fascinating.
Oh, this is a great point in the book.
Because Scandinavia is frequently cited in global discourse as the pinnacle of progressive gender-neutral policy.
Right, the ultimate egalitarian society.
But Riker utilizes data from Sweden to show that despite decades of intensive social engineering aimed at erasing gender norms, the country maintains one of the most highly gender-segregated job markets on the planet.
The numbers are wild. He cites that over 90% of engineers there are men, and over 90% of nurses are women.
So Riker uses those statistics to argue that when a society actually removes financial and cultural pressures, men and women default to their biological predispositions even more strongly.
Exactly. The book attempts to dismantle the idea of equality of outcome by highlighting the friction it causes at the individual level.
Right, he includes that specific anecdote about a father in Sweden.
Yeah, the one with the 15-year-old daughter. She had a strong aptitude for mathematics and wanted to pursue engineering.
Right, and when she takes this ambition to her school counselor, someone the book describes as a staunch advocate for equality quotas, the counselor subtly pressures the girl away from engineering and toward nursing.
Which seems entirely backwards based on her skills.
Exactly. The counselor's rationale, according to the anecdote, was that the workforce needed more women in caregiving roles to balance the statistics.
completely sidestepping the students' actual talents and desires.
Riker frames this as the inevitable endpoint of ideological capture, a system that prioritizes demographic quotas over individual merit and natural inclination.
And he extends this critique to Norway's 2008 corporate gender quotas, too.
Right. The law that mandated 40% of board members in publicly traded companies be women.
Riker brings in a University of Michigan study that analyzed the aftermath of this policy.
And the study claims the mandate led to rampant tokenism.
Yeah. Riker points out that rather than empowering women, the policy forced companies to elevate underqualified individuals purely to satisfy the legal quota.
And the text notes that this overshadowed the women who had organically earned their positions through merit.
Which is incredibly unfair to them. According to the study Riker cites, the downstream effects included a measurable drop in company performance.
Widespread resentment within the corporate hierarchy.
And a general erosion of trust in leadership. He uses this to argue that forced social engineering inherently destabilizes functional systems.
So to provide a counterexample, Riker reaches back to antiquity, specifically ancient Sparta.
He loves the Spartan model.
He holds Sparta up as a historical blueprint of a society that didn't attempt to blur the lines between the sexes. Instead, they weaponized their biological differences for the strength of the state.
The book details the Spartan division of labor as unapologetically rigid. Men were subjected to the agoge,
Right, trained from childhood to be warriors.
with the explicit expectation that they might die in battle for the state. While women were revered, but specifically in their capacity as mothers and managers of the Spartan estates.
They engaged in physical fitness, not to fight, but to ensure they could bear resilient children.
And Riker argues this extreme polarization of roles creates a remarkably stable and dominant civilization.
But the cautionary tale he extracts from Sparta revolves around its decline.
Right. He contends that as Sparta grew comfortable and began to dilute these traditional roles, allowing men to drift away from their strict warrior ethos and altering the established social dynamics, the civilization lost its foundational strength and eventually crumbled.
Riker uses the Spartan collapse as a historical mirror for the modern West. The perspective here is that pushing for gender neutrality doesn't elevate a society. It introduces systemic chaos.
And this acts as the bridge into his broader theory of institutional capture.
Right, because if a society is actively punishing these biological traits, it begs the question of how those traits are being managed or suppressed in modern environments.
Which leads directly into his concept of the war on men and his analysis of cultural Marxism.
The text introduces cultural Marxism not just as a buzzword. He attempts to define it as the transposition of Marxist class warfare onto modern gender dynamics.
In Riker's framework, traditional Marxism pitted the proletariat against the bourgeoisie.
The working class versus the owners.
Right. He argues that cultural Marxism replaces class with gender, framing women as the perpetually oppressed class and men as the systemic oppressors.
And Riker argues this ideology has metastasized throughout the educational system, the media, and the government.
According to the book, the primary objective of this ideological shift is to pathologize traditional masculinity.
The term toxic masculinity gets dissected at length here.
Oh, yeah. Riker views it as a linguistic trap, deliberately designed to shame men for the very characteristics aggression, competitiveness, and a propensity for risk that historically built and defended civilizations.
He points to the legal and educational systems to demonstrate how this plays out in practice, focusing heavily on Title IX.
Which was originally drafted to ensure equal opportunity in education.
Right, but Riker asserts it has been weaponized into an administrative witch hunt against young men on college campuses.
To anchor this claim, he meticulously details a 2014 case at the University of Tennessee.
This case was wild to read about. A male student was accused of sexual assault, and Riker emphasizes that the accused presented text messages
Corroborating witnesses.
and even passed a polygraph test indicating his innocence.
Despite all that evidence, the book notes the student was expelled, stripped of his scholarship, and had his academic future derailed.
Riker uses this specific case to support a broader, highly controversial claim that over 90% of accused men in Title IX tribunals are found guilty.
He paints a picture of a shadow justice system operating within universities, one that actively subverts the presumption of innocence and denies basic due process to male students.
Moving from the campus to the culture at large, Riker examines the role of the media in shaping public perception.
He introduces a concept he calls the disposable male syndrome.
The text observes a stark dichotomy in how male suffering is portrayed.
On one hand, the media glorifies male sacrifice. Riker points to the mechanisms of World War II propaganda and the structure of modern action films.
Where the male protagonist's value is directly correlated to his willingness to bleed, endure immense physical trauma, and ultimately die for the benefit of others.
The messaging, as Riker interprets it, is that a man's utility is tied strictly to his disposability.
Right. But when the media depicts men in mundane, everyday settings, the portrayal flips to outright mockery.
He compares television tropes across decades, contrasting the 1950s structure of shows like Father Knows Best.
Where the patriarch was positioned as a competent, respected leader.
Exactly. Contrasting that with modern sitcom tropes. Characters like Homer Simpson or Peter Griffin.
Riker argues these aren't just comedic archetypes. He views them as a form of cultural programming.
The persistent depiction of the bumbling, incompetent dad who constantly needs to be managed by a smarter, more capable wife.
It sends a sustained societal message that men, particularly in domestic and paternal roles, are inherently inept and unnecessary.
Now, Riker looks for historical precedents for this kind of cultural reengineering, and he draws a massive parallel to the Soviet Union in the 1920s.
After the Bolshevik Revolution, the state enacted sweeping policies to dismantle the traditional nuclear family.
Because they viewed it as a capitalist construct.
The book details the policies pushed by figures like Alexandra Kollontai. This included state-sponsored communal child-rearing and aggressive campaigns to push women into all sectors of heavy industry.
And Riker notes the catastrophic social fallout of these experiments. Stripped of their historical roles as the primary providers and heads of the household, Soviet men experienced a massive crisis of purpose.
The text highlights that divorce rates completely destabilized the society. Millions of children ended up abandoned.
Essentially roaming the streets as wards of the state.
Furthermore, Riker points to a resulting epidemic of alcoholism and severe depression among the emasculated male population.
The social decay became so unmanageable that the Soviet government was quietly forced to walk back these policies.
They had to aggressively promote traditional family structures again just to save the state from collapse.
Riker leverages this Soviet history as a direct warning for the contemporary West. He suggests that modern attempts to deconstruct gender roles will inevitably yield the exact same social fragmentation.
If we synthesize his points on institutional capture, the media's disposable male trope, and the historical warnings, Riker is arguing that modern men are being funneled into a system designed to extract their labor while neutralizing their biological instincts.
Which transitions into how these systemic issues manifest in the personal lives of men, particularly concerning marriage, the workplace, and the sexual marketplace.
Right, let's get into theme 3, the modern traps. The text does not hold back when analyzing modern marriage.
Not at all.
Riker explicitly labels it a rigged game and refers to the institution as a marriage plantation.
His central thesis here is that family courts operate on a foundation of gynocentrism.
A systemic bias that inherently prioritizes the emotional and financial security of women at the direct expense of men.
He argues that the legal system still operates on the archaic assumption that men are the primary resource generators, making them vulnerable to devastating financial judgments during a divorce.
He attempts to illustrate this with a case study of a man in California. The anecdote involves a man legally mandated to pay $10,000 a month in alimony.
10 grand a month.
Right. And the crucial detail Riker highlights is that the ex-wife is already cohabitating rent-free with a new partner.
So the man is essentially forced by the state to underwrite his ex-wife's new life with another man,
while his own resources are systematically drained.
Riker uses this to critique the broader cultural narrative surrounding divorce. He points to the publishing and film phenomenon of eat, pray, love.
The text argues that modern culture aggressively romanticizes female-initiated divorce as a journey of self-discovery and empowerment.
However, Riker notes that the cultural conversation entirely omits the resulting financial ruin, the loss of child access, and the emotional devastation experienced by the men left in the wake of these decisions.
The book posits that society views male collateral damage as an acceptable, even necessary byproduct of female liberation.
From there, Riker pivots his focus to the workplace, specifically targeting the mainstream discourse around the wage gap.
He attempts to dismantle the narrative that women earn less than men due to systemic patriarchal discrimination.
Instead, Riker attributes the earnings disparity to a combination of biological imperatives, risk tolerance, and individual choices.
He brings in a 2018 Harvard Business Review study demonstrating that men are 50% more likely to work over 50 hours a week.
Riker's framework suggests that men are driven by a biological need to accumulate resources as a means of increasing their social and sexual status.
Consequently, they self-select into higher stress, higher paying, and significantly more dangerous fields.
Like finance or physical engineering.
Women, according to Riker's interpretation of the data, more frequently prioritize work-life balance and gravitate toward lower risk, highly fulfilling, but statistically lower paying professions like teaching or social work.
And the text pushes this argument further by introducing what Riker calls the death gap.
The statistics he utilizes here are stark. He notes that men are 10 times more likely to suffer a fatal accident on the job than women.
They comprise 93% of all workplace fatalities.
He points to the men dominating the most hazardous sectors of the economy: logging, deep-sea fishing, mining, high-rise construction, and oil rig operations.
Riker's critique is that there is a loud cultural demand for gender parity in safe, climate-controlled corporate boardrooms.
But absolute silence regarding the dangerous, physically destructive labor that keeps the infrastructure of civilization functioning.
He argues this exposes a societal hypocrisy that takes male physical sacrifice entirely for granted.
Now, this analysis of resource gathering and status leads directly into Riker's brutal assessment of modern dating.
Oh, the sexual marketplace chapter.
Right, which he frames strictly as a marketplace. If you're listening, you might be familiar with the terminology he uses here, as he leans heavily into the concept of hypergamy to explain the current dynamics.
Especially how technology has accelerated it. Riker uses data scraped from major dating applications like Tinder and Bumble to illustrate what he calls the 80-20 rule.
The algorithmic data, according to the text, reveals a highly skewed distribution of attention.
Roughly 80% of women on these platforms are competing for the top 10 to 20% of men.
Riker argues that if you fall into the category of an average-earning, average-looking man, the digital marketplace renders you virtually invisible.
And he attributes this massive disparity to hypergamy. But it's important to note, Riker doesn't view hypergamy as a moral failing.
No, he views it as a hardwired, evolutionary female instinct to date up.
To secure a mate with higher social status, greater resource gathering capability, and superior physical dominance.
Because women carry the biological burden of reproduction, he argues they are evolutionarily programmed to be ruthlessly selective gatekeepers.
The book provides an illustrative hypothetical here. A 32-year-old, six-figure earning female lawyer dating a stable, kind-hearted school teacher.
Riker argues that while the relationship might be comfortable, her hypergamous instincts remain active.
The moment a higher status individual, say, an aggressive, wealthy corporate executive signals interest, she is biologically driven to pivot away from the teacher.
Riker insists this isn't malicious behavior, it's simply the algorithmic reality of human evolutionary psychology, operating without traditional social constraints.
Because technology has hyper-accelerated this dynamic, giving women access to the top 20% of men on a global scale.
And this leads to the book issuing severe warnings against simping.
Riker defines this as a man attempting to negotiate desire through subservience.
Putting a woman on a pedestal, sacrificing his resources, and acting as an emotional sounding board in the futile hope of eventually winning her romantic affection.
The author asserts that women are biologically incapable of feeling sexual attraction or genuine respect for a man who exhibits these submissive traits.
The text explores the mechanics of the friend zone, describing it not as a waiting room for romance, but as a permanent dead end.
Riker argues that women do not desire a male companion who functions as a surrogate girlfriend. Their biological programming seeks a leader.
They are drawn to the exact traits that modern institutions label as toxic: unapologetic dominance, assertiveness, and an unyielding, mission-driven confidence.
He details the classic scenario of the man who spends years being the supportive best friend.
Helping her move, listening to her complain about the men she actually dates, providing constant validation.
And when he finally reveals his romantic intentions, he is met with the devastating, "You're like a brother to me."
Riker utilizes this to hammer home a core tenet of his playbook. If a man fails to establish himself as a confident, high-status sexual prospect from the very first interaction, he is permanently categorized as emotional utility, not a prize.
The men who are too focused on building their own empires to text back immediately are the ones who trigger actual hypergamous desire.
The accumulation of these factors leads Riker to analyze the severe psychological fallout.
Right, because if men are navigating a legal system that views them as liabilities, a culture that mocks their nature, and a hyper-competitive sexual marketplace that ignores the majority of them, the internal damage is profound.
Which transitions us perfectly into the book's fourth major theme, the psychological toll, with a specific focus on the crisis of fatherhood, mental health, and the descent into nihilism.
Riker posits that the systemic suppression of natural masculine traits is the primary driver of the current male mental health crisis.
He traces a significant portion of this societal decay to the breakdown of the nuclear family, identifying fatherlessness as the central catastrophe of the modern era.
He looks at specific policy impacts, heavily critiquing the 1994 U.S. crime bill.
The text argues that the punitive measures of that legislation disproportionately removed millions of black men from their communities.
Resulting in a staggering 70% of black children being raised in homes without a father present.
Riker utilizes this demographic as a case study for the broader consequences of father absence, and the statistics he provides regarding the downstream effects are grim.
He notes that young boys growing up in fatherless homes are 4 times more likely to drop out of high school.
And an alarming 20 times more likely to be incarcerated.
The book forcefully argues that fathers are not merely secondary caregivers, they are the essential backbone of civic stability.
Riker suggests that fathers provide the necessary friction, discipline, and moral scaffolding required to teach boys how to harness their natural aggression into productive avenues.
Without that male-centric guidance, Riker observes that boys are left adrift, highly susceptible to identity crises, academic failure, and unchanneled rage.
But Riker notes that even men who remain present and engaged are caught in a psychological meat grinder, a phenomenon he labels the feminist double bind.
He argues that society subjects men to deeply contradictory demands.
Right. On one side, the traditional expectation remains. Be the stoic provider, absorb the stress, and handle the physical dangers.
But simultaneously, modern culture aggressively demands that men become more vulnerable, that they cry, and that they freely share their emotional insecurities.
Riker views this demand for vulnerability as a trap. The text shares an anecdote of a man who, after undergoing modern therapy, decided to fully open up to his long-term girlfriend about his deep-seated fears and insecurities,
And rather than deepening their bond, the book states she dumped him shortly thereafter.
citing that he simply wasn't assertive enough.
Riker points to the cruel irony of the situation. He argues that while women cognitively state they desire a sensitive, emotionally transparent partner, their hypergamous biological instincts are immediately repelled by displays of weakness.
The double bind is absolute. If a man leans into his masculine nature, he is socially condemned as toxic. If he yields and displays vulnerability, he is romantically discarded as weak.
The text draws a direct line from this impossible, contradictory existence to the male suicide epidemic.
Riker highlights the devastating statistic that men are nearly 4 times more likely to die by suicide than women.
He attributes this mortality rate to the reality that men are culturally forced to deny their intrinsic nature while receiving zero societal empathy when they inevitably fail to meet these paradoxical standards.
Riker argues they suffer in silence, because articulating their pain is viewed as another form of weakness in a culture that fundamentally devalues them.
Faced with this reality, Riker observes that a vast segment of the male population simply checks out, falling into what he terms the nihilist trap.
Looking at the landscape of biased family courts, algorithmically brutal dating apps, and hostile media, many men rationally decide the game is not worth playing.
They retreat into highly engineered forms of modern escapism.
The book details how this nihilism manifests. Men replace the difficult pursuit of real-world status with the artificial dopamine loops of video games.
They substitute the challenging dynamics of relationship building with the endless, low-effort consumption of pornography.
Or the pursuit of superficial validation through social media.
Riker argues these technologies act as a pacifier, keeping men docile and disconnected from their potential.
However, Riker's goal is not to leave the reader in a state of despair. He shifts from diagnosing the problem to prescribing a rigorous philosophical remedy.
He urges men to abandon modern therapeutic models and instead look to ancient philosophical frameworks.
Specifically highlighting Stoicism and the concept of amor fati, the love of one's fate.
He draws heavily on the writings of Marcus Aurelius, arguing that a man must accept the harsh, rigged nature of the modern world without succumbing to self-pity.
Amor fati requires using the friction of a hostile society as the very fuel needed to forge a stronger self.
Riker also incorporates elements of the samurai code, emphasizing emotional mastery
The embrace of rigorous physical discipline,
and the absolute necessity of taking decisive, forward moving action rather than adopting the mentality of a victim.
which transitions us directly into the core actionable section of the book, Theme 5, the Red Pill Playbook.
Having laid out the architecture of the war on men, Riker provides a strict, unapologetic roadmap designed to help men break free from these systemic traps and build lives of sovereign power.
He argues that survival requires intense self-improvement, the explicit rejection of societal expectations, the creation of male-exclusive networks, and a hyper-focus on legacy.
The foundational pillar of this playbook is the philosophy of MGTOW, or men going their own way.
The text praises the men who possess the clarity to look at the statistical realities of the marriage plantation and the skewed sexual marketplace and make the conscious, strategic decision to opt out.
But Riker is careful to distinguish MGTOW from the nihilistic retreat he warned about earlier.
Opting out, in his framework, does not mean retreating to the couch. It is defined as a massive redirection of energy.
Instead of expending time, capital, and emotional bandwidth attempting to appease women or conform to societal milestones, a man redirects all of those resources strictly toward his own optimization.
The red pill truth Riker pushes is that a man's intrinsic value is not derived from his utility to women. It comes from his capacity to build physical resilience, secure absolute financial independence, and cultivate mental sovereignty.
And to maintain this sovereignty, Riker stresses the non-negotiable need for brotherhood.
The text argues that men are biologically tribal creatures who require the friction and accountability of male-only spaces to reach their highest potential.
He points to historical networks, specifically citing the Knights Templar and the Freemasons as blueprints.
Riker uses these groups to illustrate how men historically achieved geopolitical greatness. It wasn't through seeking the validation of the broader society or conforming to the comforts of domestic life.
It was achieved through shared, dangerous missions, strict hierarchical discipline, and the intergenerational transfer of knowledge through male mentorship.
The book observes that modern men are suffering from a profound crisis of isolation. Fraternal organizations have been culturally marginalized.
And male-exclusive spaces are frequently targeted and dismantled by progressive policies that label them as exclusionary or discriminatory.
So Riker commands his readers to actively reconstruct these spaces in their own lives. He advises men to aggressively vet their peers, find a small cadre of men with aligned values, establish rigid accountability structures, and forge a modern, localized tribe.
Riker also provides a nuanced analysis of how men must interact with modern technology and ancient traditions.
He frames the internet as the ultimate double-edged sword for the modern man.
It can be a digital pacifier, a nihilistic echo chamber that consumes a man's time and energy.
But, conversely, Riker views it as the greatest equalizer in human history.
It allows men to completely bypass the captured institutional gatekeepers, the universities, the corporate media, the traditional financial systems.
To build sovereign wealth, distribute uncensored ideas, and connect with other red-pilled men globally.
He insists that a man must become a master of technology, utilizing it as a tool for empire building rather than a mechanism for mindless consumption.
And in a fascinating juxtaposition to his focus on technology, Riker makes a strong pivot toward the necessity of religious frameworks.
He critiques modern secularism, arguing that it has stripped men of a coherent moral compass, leaving them adrift in a sea of hedonism and nihilism.
The book references the Crusades, using them not necessarily as a literal call to holy war, but as a powerful historical metaphor.
Riker argues that men inherently crave a higher calling, a moral code and a mission that demands physical and spiritual sacrifice.
He suggests that adopting a rigorous religious or philosophical framework provides the necessary gravity to keep a man grounded when the surrounding culture is pushing him toward degeneracy.
When discussing the mindset required to navigate this landscape, Riker employs the historical metaphor of James Watt and the invention of the steam engine.
During the immense upheaval of the Industrial Revolution, physical labor paradigms were shattered overnight.
Riker points out that the men who thrived didn't form support groups to complain about the loss of agrarian jobs. They ruthlessly adapted.
They learned the new mechanics, they built the machines, and they engineered a new era of civilization.
Riker insists that the future belongs exclusively to men who embody that exact spirit of ruthless adaptability.
The text warns that complacency is the ultimate enemy of the masculine spirit. A man who believes he has arrived and stops aggressively expanding his skill set, his physical capabilities, and his resource base is a man who has already begun to die.
Continuous, punishing forward momentum is the only acceptable baseline.
And all of these directives, the physical optimization, the rejection of the modern scripts, the forging of brotherhood, and the mastering of technology culminate in the book's final and most crucial directive, the pursuit of legacy.
Riker argues that the modern obsession with momentary pleasure or relationship status is a distraction from a man's true biological imperative.
He directs the reader to study the founding fathers of the United States. They didn't risk the gallows and exhaust their fortunes for fleeting validation.
They engaged in high-stakes collaboration, intellectual warfare, and extreme physical risk to construct an architecture that would outlast them.
Riker issues a final challenge. True masculinity is measured by the tangible mark a man leaves on the world, the resources he secures for his lineage, and the uncompromising example of leadership he provides for the next generation of men.
It is an incredibly dense, multi-layered text. If we synthesize the breadth of this deep dive, Conrad Riker's No More Simps operates as an unapologetic, controversial roadmap for men navigating the ideological battlegrounds of the modern era.
He is demanding that his readers stop apologizing for their evolutionary biology, thoroughly reject the structural narratives of cultural Marxism and feminism.
And reclaim their historical dominance through a process of brutal self-optimization, the establishment of exclusionary male networks, and a complete refusal to play by the rules of what he deems a rigged societal game.
Riker covers an immense amount of ground, providing a framework that is actively shaping conversations within the manosphere. And this brings us to a final provocative thought for you to consider, building on the architecture of Riker's worldview.
Right. Because Riker's entire thesis hinges on the idea that male fulfillment is inextricably biologically hardwired to the acts of providing, protecting, and embracing extreme physical risk. Those are the engines that built the modern world.
Exactly.
But as we rapidly accelerate toward an era of total automation, where artificial intelligence and advanced robotics are systematically eliminating both traditional physical labor and physical danger, how will men satisfy those ancient, hardwired imperatives?
It's a great question.
Will the construction of online businesses, the formation of digital brotherhoods, and the exploration of virtual frontiers be sufficient to satiate the primal physical drive that Riker argues is the absolute core of the male spirit?
That is a massive question to ponder as the technological landscape shifts under our feet. If you want to dig into the raw source material and read this Red Pill manifesto for yourself, go check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books right now to buy the ebook.
Definitely go check it out.
And be sure to follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack to keep up with his latest writings and updates. If this deep dive gave you an aha moment or challenged your perspective on the shifting dynamics of modern society, please like and subscribe to the show right now so we can keep bringing you these extensive explorations. Thank you for diving deep with us today.